know something about what it is to be a black and brown body in privileged spaces already. You will continue to access that knowledge in the years to come. Oh, see, brownness comes in many forms. It's not only a matter of pigmentation. And what I want to insist on is the extent to which each of you is in a position to draw on your knowledge to not only navigate the school and academic context that you'll find yourselves in the next 10, 15, 20 years, but also to affect real change, the kind of change that our communities and our society need. So that's the aim for the next 20 or so minutes that I'll be talking about. So first, a little bit about myself. I wrote a book. Yay! I wrote a book. It's awesome. Here it is. And the book is the story of my life. I arrived in the United States as a 4-year-old. I came from the Dominican Republic with my family. I see some clapping. And when we arrived in the States, we initially, my parents and I, were under the impression that we would just be in New York City for a few months. The reason we came to the States was because my mom needed medical care. She was pretty sick. She was having a really complicated second pregnancy, and doctors had advised her to come to New York City and seek prenatal care. While she was getting prenatal care, I was enrolled in kindergarten, and something happened in kindergarten. I really liked it. Or more specifically, I really liked learning English. I began walking around imitating people, which my parents found to be really embarrassing. I would practice random English words whose meanings I did not know in front of my parents. And I took every opportunity to watch English movies, some of which did not feature the most child-appropriate language, and then trotting out that language right back at my parents, who were horrified and shocked. But they were also very excited because they came to see in my willingness to immerse myself in the learning of a second language an opportunity for their eldest son. And as my mom underwent prenatal treatment and eventually gave birth to my brother, she and my dad began having a series of conversations about whether they should stay in the States or return to the Dominican Republic. There were some pros to returning to the Dominican Republic. My dad and mom had pretty stable employment there. And they had family there. Everything they knew and that they cared about was in the Dominican Republic. In New York City, by contrast, there was the cultural shock of adjusting to a new country and a new language, but there was also the excitement of the educational opportunities that they could ensure that their children had that might not be available to them in Santo Domingo. And so, my parents decided to stay. But then things got a little dicey. So we had arrived on tourist visas, and these tourist visas had expired, and my parents were aware of the need to do what's called an adjustment of status. They needed to get proper legal immigrant status, and so they had to transition from this one visa category into another category. But they didn't know how to do this, and so what they did was to ask around. They asked all their Dominican friends, they asked our family members in the States who had some knowledge of the process, and eventually they were directed to a person who knew a guy, who knew another guy, knew someone else, and this person claimed to be able to help my parents sort out their immigration status. But it turned out that he was a giant con artist because he took my parents' savings and then he disappeared, never to be heard from again. And my parents did not have their immigration status adjusted. I did not have my immigration status adjusted, and so that meant that we were undocumented. We did not have what in Spanish we would call papeles. My parents weren't the kind of people who would be sort of deterred or put off by this, so they said, well, we just got to forge ahead. We just got to keep working and provide for our children, and everything's going to work itself out in the long term. But one of the challenges of not having proper immigrant documentation is that, well, it's very hard to maintain secure and steady employment. And this is something that my parents came to confront over the course of the next few years after our arrival. Inevitably, the same questions would be asked of my dad, whatever job he took up. Where's your authorization? What is your social security number? And my dad couldn't provide that, and neither could my mom. And so they both hopped around from job to job. we hopped around from neighborhood to neighborhood, since every few months it looked likely that we might be evicted. So we started out in Washington Heights, and then we moved to the Bronx, and then we moved to an apartment in Corona, and then we moved to another apartment in Queens, this time in Jackson Heights, and then another apartment in Jackson Heights, and then Elmhurst too. But we got a lot of Queens actually in the front row.
Sorry, nobody ever comes from Queens.
Queens pride. So I will say I have 4 of the 5 boroughs covered. I have only not lived in Staten Island, which, for all intents and purposes, is not a borough. So by the time I was 8, my dad had enough of this. He was really frustrated, and he wanted to head back to the Dominican Republic. And it was at that point that he and my mom decided to split up, because my mom was very insistent by this point that we stay in the United States. She was a firm believer in the importance of the educational opportunities that could come her children's way here in New York City, and she didn't want to head back to the Dominican Republic. And so my dad did, and my dad left. He left his sons and his wife. Eventually he and my mom got divorced, and my mom took on the challenge of raising her 2 sons on her own. So for the first few months after my dad left, things looked okay, but then my mom wasn't able to continue working the set of odd jobs that she'd put together, and we were evicted from our apartment in Queens. And we eventually entered the shelter system after staying in someone's basement for a while. We spent the entirety of my 4th grade year in the shelter system, and in the shelter system 2 things happened that would prove to be tremendously transformative. The first was that I began to read a lot. I'd always been a reader. I was pretty bookish. My parents were very bookish. But I had absolutely nothing to do in the shelter system after school because we didn't have TV. And we had nothing. We had no Nintendo, nothing. We had absolutely nothing at all, except books. It so happened that the shelter, which had been a converted public school building, had a library. And so I went to this library every day after school, and I just read as much and as often as I could. And I came across one book that I absolutely loved. It was titled How People Lived in Ancient Greece and Rome. It has some pretty cool illustrations, but it also had an argument that really captivated me. The argument was that the ancient Greek and Roman worlds had passed down to us a legacy, and that this legacy was apparent in so many things in the here and now, in the 20th century back then, or the 21st century now, and that it was important to learn about this legacy, to appreciate this legacy. I became so interested in the Greeks and Romans that I decided, right then and there, that at some point I would have to learn Latin, and I would have to learn ancient Greek too. So all of you had Latin your first day, didn't you? Yes! Woo! You're on the path. This is going down. But what that book did for me at that moment in time was to inspire me with a vision of a world that was radically different from the world that I inhabited. This world, it should be noted, was one that was not fairer or better than the world I inhabited at the time, but it was different. And what was important to me living in the shelter system at the time was the prospect of imagining a world that was different from the world in which I was growing up. The capacity to imagine different worlds and different possibilities was one that was provided to me through reading. And that was the first and in the long term most transformative experience I had in the shelter system. But there was a second experience I had in the shelter system, and this came about while I was in a shelter in Bushwick, to which we were assigned after having spent the better part of a year in Chinatown. And in the shelter in Bushwick, I happened to be reading in a corner one afternoon, when an adult came up to me. He was very tall, and he was very white. And I had no conversations with tall white men before. So this was a moment, an occasion for me. And what I found so interesting about this man, who was an arts volunteer at my shelter, was that he wanted to talk to me about what it was that I was reading. And this was significant for me because up to that point, outside of my immediate family, I had no conversations with people, with adults, about the books that I was reading, except in my public school classrooms, where I would typically be asked to take a log of the books that I was reading and annotate in my little diary how many books I had read over the course of the preceding month, and so on and so forth. No one had ever actually asked me questions about what it was that I was reading. And what's more, he seemed genuinely interested in what made me tick. He wanted to know everything about me. But not in the kind of way that I've become accustomed to in my dealings, helping my mom figure out the public assistance and benefit system, where people would ask all these very sort of pro forma questions about, well, when did your dad leave you, or how long have you been homeless? These weren't the kinds of questions that he was interested in asking. He wanted to know why it was that I was interested in, say, Greek and Roman history, or why it was that I was fascinated by this particular book I was reading when we first met, which was a biography of Napoleon. Why it was that I found these kinds of things captivating. And in an effort to give an account of myself to this person, I realized that here was a prospect of having a father figure in my life. But here was the prospect also of having a friend who was genuinely committed to sharing the same kind of intellectual excitement that I had for the kinds of things I found to be worthwhile reading and engaging with. So it turned out that this arts volunteer who was interested in me could do more than simply engage me in conversation. He was also very, very well connected to the New York City private school system. He was an alum of Collegiate in Riverdale, and he proposed to my mom that we apply to one of the New York City private schools. And thanks to his help and the help of the Prep for Prep program, I was eventually admitted to Collegiate, and I started attending Collegiate in the 7th grade. So by that point, when I arrived at Collegiate, I was no longer living in the shelter system. My family, and I were living in an apartment in Central Harlem. But this apartment building was, to put it bluntly, pretty grim. We had blackouts all the time, and our tap water was very dirty. But it was only up to that point something that I had grown accustomed to already. The apartment building wasn't any different from some of the other places in which we had lived, which is what made my adjustment to Collegiate all the more jarring. Because when I arrived at Collegiate, I discovered that there were people who were fantastically wealthy, and who lived in these apartments that made mine look like a box. When I arrived at Collegiate, I became friends with someone who lived not that far away from Browning. And he invited me over to his apartment, and I noticed as I stepped into his apartment that his kitchen was bigger than my entire apartment. And I was like, wow, people live in this place. It's incredible. I also noticed that he had so many more books than I could even imagine being in one person's apartment. And this stimulated two kinds of feelings in me. And this will now get me to begin to talk about what the adjustments moving forward in your lives might consist of. The first feeling this provoked was pure, naked envy. I was envious of all the things that my classmates had. And I grew up ever more jealous of those things in the years after my first collision with their privilege at Collegiate. But the second feeling it inspired in me was a sense of the acute gaps in the lives of those who came from my background on the one hand, and those who inhabited the worlds that my classmates inhabited on the other. There were these yawning discrepancies in the kinds of things we had access to, and the big question that I found myself grappling with was why? Why is it the case that my classmates have access to all these opportunities and I don't? And one of the answers that began to take shape in my little head, my 7th and 8th grade head, was that in fact my predicament, my situation was tied up in a nexus of many other situations. That I was in fact someone who was experiencing what we might nowadays term systemic oppression. It wasn't only that I was poor and had been homeless. It was also that I was pigmented a certain way, that I was undocumented. All of these factors had conspired to put me in a position of profound structural disadvantage. And so the next question then became, of course, well, what is it that I can do about this? What is it that I am positioned to do not only to criticize this system that has created this gap between my classmates on the one hand and me on the other, but what is it about my learning in particular, in my education, that will empower me with the tools I need in order to affect lasting change? So you'll remember that while I was in the shelter system, I took up this book on how people lived in ancient Greece and Rome. And I had made a promise to myself while in the shelter system that at some point I would learn Latin, at some point I would learn ancient Greek. Well, at collegiate, I could do both. And so that is exactly what I did. The reason I decided to take up those two languages had partly to do with the fact that I was encountering, over the course of my middle school and early high school years, all of these texts that I was reading in translation, but that I knew had originally been written in Latin and Greek, that really spoke to me in a profound way. So I wanted to learn the languages that would enable me to read them in the original. I read the Odyssey for the first time the summer before arriving at collegiate, and then again a few years later while at collegiate. And what resonated with me so powerfully about the Odyssey was Telemachus' quest to find the father figure. It's that quest that mirrored my own efforts over the course of my middle school and high school years to find and understand my own father figure, or my own father figures. I read the Iliad, and I was struck by the extent to which rage could warp and alter the fabric of people's beings, and how that rage could lead to disastrous effects, not only for individuals, but for communities. But I was also impressed in the Iliad with the extent to which communal healing and the possibility of forgiveness were presented as things that were worthy to aspire to and worthy to seek. While reading all these texts, I had one problem to deal with that loomed large over everything, and it was that I was still undocumented. But I didn't think about it that often on an active, everyday level, because I found myself having to contend with all of these microaggressions that began to rear their heads in school, and that occupied far more of my energy on a day-to-day basis than dealing with the substantive reality of being undocumented. We didn't even call them microaggressions at the time because we didn't have the language for that yet. But in hindsight, they were not even quite so micro. Some of them were very macro. And some of those assumptions were ones that clearly left an imprint not only on me, but on some of my classmates, and still talk about them to this day. For example, when I arrived at collegiate, I discovered that some of my classmates thought that I knew everything about hip-hop. I knew something about hip-hop, but I didn't know everything. And my classmates, some of them seemed to think that I was like a born expert on the Wu-Tang Clan. It was very popular when I was young. Why did they think this exactly? Well, it was because they had made certain assumptions about me. I was living in Central Harlem, and I was dark-skinned, therefore I had to know about Wu-Tang. And I was content at the time to play along with this, and to indulge them in their thoughts about why it was that I, being a dark-skinned person from Harlem, would in fact know everything about Wu-Tang. But in the years after, I realized that this enabled them to fit me into other boxes, and those boxes were a little harder to deal with and accept. When I was in high school, it slowly became clear to me that some of my classmates had fallen prey to certain kinds of racializing assumptions about how I spoke and how that matched up with my intellect, or what they perceived to be my intellect. So I was accustomed to speaking in a hip-hop vernacular, which I am not using for the purposes of this presentation. And so some of them, my school was pretty open when it came to the publicity of people's grades. That I had written a paper that had gotten an A, and my other classmates had written papers that had gotten B pluses. They would be like, what? Danelle got an A? How could he have gotten an A? Microaggression 2. Microaggression 3 came in the form of my teachers. And here I have to tell you a two-part story. I had teachers who were phenomenal at collegiate. And I'll talk more about why they were so phenomenal in a moment, and what they did to change my life that helped me come up with the visions that ultimately guided me to college and beyond. But I also had teachers who not only partook of some of the assumptions that my classmates seemed to have running amok in their heads, but who acted on them. So I had one teacher who threw me out of class all the time And initially she threw me out of class because I was being really obnoxious. But then it became clear that there was actually something else going on, and something that we had to address not only in respect to me, but in respect to some of the other darker skinned students in the class. Because it turned out that this same teacher was confusing the 4 black kids in class with each other. She couldn't keep our names straight. And there was another teacher who would ask only the darker skinned students to clean the blackboard, which I thought was some real return to some racist-ish that I thought had since been overcome, but which it was transparently clear had not been overcome. How did I deal with this? So for starters, there is no question that some of the experiences I had at collegiate left their mark on my sense of self, right? There was no way that I could get around the fact that these experiences conditioned how I came to see myself. But it was also because of the agency of some of the truly excellent teachers at collegiate that I was able to begin imagining myself in different ways, as someone who could not only, for example, be an active force for change in the school, but as someone who had a future in academia, someone who might, from his interest in the Greek and Roman world, actually study this and make a living out of studying this, make a living about writing about it. There was one teacher in particular who changed my life. This teacher had so much faith in me that she was perfectly content to allow me to enroll in as many classes with her as I wanted to, as many classes as could possibly fit in my schedule. To the point that my junior year of high school, I didn't have lunch because I wanted to take so many classes with her that I willingly gave up lunch in order to spend more time in her classroom. But the reason I wanted to spend more time in her classroom was because she inspired in me the notion that it didn't matter where I came from or what my status was or what my experiences had been up to that point. All that mattered was that I came into that classroom committed and willing to learn and committed and willing to engage. That is all. In the end, she insisted to each and every single one of us, what matters the most, far more than any of the variables and contingencies of your background, is the extent to which on any given day you show up to the classroom and are resolved to tackle the texts that are presented to you, the problems that are assigned to you, and to do your very best at tackling those. Now that's not to say that I could sort of inhabit this bubble that this teacher created forever and ever. Because every time I stepped out of her classroom, well, guess what? There was the real world. There was the real world of the circumstances that my family had to grapple with. But it was wonderful and empowering and uplifting to be in a space, if only for 40 minutes to an hour and a half each day, where that sense of the real world's encroachments on my sense of self could be suspended and in fact supplanted by a new vision of myself in which all that mattered was my capacity and determination to focus on the work that had been assigned in the classroom. Thanks in part to this teacher, I became really interested in applying to Princeton. And I wanted to apply to Princeton because I heard from my teacher that this school had the best classics program in the country. Later I learned that she might have been skewing things just a little to get me to apply to Princeton, which was a school that she loved. But here I was faced with a challenge. The challenge was that as I approached the latter years of high school, it had become clear that being undocumented would be a huge problem for college admissions. And it would be a problem because different schools seem to have different informal policies for dealing with undocumented students. And here's where another mentor came to save the day. My college guidance counselor did not know that I was undocumented, and in fact, no one at the school knew I was undocumented until I started talking about it my junior year of high school. But when I told him, he not only resolved to support me, he also ensured that I would know everything I needed to know in order to approach Princeton with the particulars of my situation, and prepared me to have the conversations at Princeton that I would need to have in order to make clear to folks there that I was undocumented, but that there were merits to my application that overrode the simple fact of my being undocumented, and that that shouldn't be held against me in any way. And it was in part because of that college counselor that I ended up at Princeton. From Princeton to Oxford to Stanford is a story that could take us another 25 minutes. I won't spill too much of the beans. Partly because at some point, I hope each of you has a chance to read the book. But I want to end on a few notes before I open it up to your questions. So I focused a lot on some of the challenges that I faced while I was navigating the school system, especially in middle and high school, and especially in the context of my adjustment to collegiate. But there was one important and recurring reminder that I received throughout my time at collegiate and throughout my time at Princeton and beyond that helped me cope with how different each of these institutions was, how difficult it was at times to adjust to each of these institutions, and how hard it was on occasion to deal with some of the attitudes and assumptions that were being thrown my way. And that reminder was that I was loved. Now, this is a relatively simple seeming statement, but it was actually quite powerful because one of the things I recognized as I was growing older was that partly as a consequence of the experiences I had in the shelter system and after, I had developed a really withered sense of self, a really eroded sense of self, one that did not take pride in the accomplishments up to that point, one that was forever harping on all of the things that I hadn't yet done, or the missteps I had committed, or the errors I had made, or the problems that I had created for myself by not doing my homework. This sense of self that came with self-love and with the recognition that other people loved me arose not only as a consequence of my interactions with my teachers. It arose because I had a community of people around me who had had my experiences. As it turned out, the most important variable behind my success was the fact that I was nurtured by a community of folks like you. It was because I had all of these people in my life who had gone through substantially similar or identical experiences, in the case of my classmates at collegiate, who also came from backgrounds similar to mine, and with whom I could talk about some of the more challenging aspects of the adjustment to collegiate, that I was even able to maintain a measure of sanity in the first place. But the love that I felt, and the love that was so significant to shoring up my sense of self, also came from teachers and mentors. And this gets me now to one of the most important points I want to send you off with. Be careful to always maintain the connections that you develop with your teachers and mentors here and elsewhere. Because you never know when you might have to call upon each and every single one of your teachers. Not only for the kind of formal instructional guidance that will support you in the classroom, but for the kind of affirmation that you will need in order to keep grinding. Because let's face it, this is a grind at its core. This education business is a grind. Those connections are also important because one of the realizations that will, I hope, animate each of you as you pursue your dreams moving forward is a sense of our interconnectedness. And this is where I want to wrap things up. In recent months, there have been a variety of developments, some on the immigration front, some on the domestic front, some on the international front, that have really chipped away at an ideal of interconnectedness, at the vision of a pluralistic society in which we can all bring our individual, diverse, familial backgrounds to the table and engage each other in the fullness of our diversity and difference. There have been a whole host of reminders encoded in many different parts of our society, from our school systems to our justice system, to our political and civic discourse, that some people don't find this pluralistic vision to be all that valuable or even worth adhering or even paying lip service to. And one of the things I want to insist to you is that valuing this pluralistic vision and fighting for it and seeking to maintain it is really the only way forward, as I see it. It's not only about the kind of individualistic, meritocratic ethos that many of you have already been made privy to, and that you will have repeatedly drilled into you on the way through higher education, secondary education, and higher education. The ethos of, well, you can do it because you are excellent, and you will accomplish everything that you put your mind to. This is important in itself. But what is also important is the recognition that we must accomplish things as a community. And that is in the context of our own communal excellence that we can truly attain the goals that we set for ourselves. In other words, in the end, the achievements that bring you here, the achievements that you will continue to line up as accolades for your CVs moving forward, are not only the achievements that are linked to your name and to a grade report and to a teacher's report card. These are the achievements that are forged by a community coming together and expressing its solidarity around the vision that each and every single one of us is unique and valuable and deserving of the full protections afforded by our society. So that's what I'm here to sell you on. And I want to thank you for listening to me. This is exactly